I'll have a difficult task to cover in 15 minutes what I covered myself in 10 years, because this is basically a talk that stems from my, let's call it expertise in reviewing maybe hundreds of articles over the last 10 years. But obviously, I'm not going to bore you with that. In the next 15 minutes, I will try to give a brief overview of what is wrong with current tobacco harm reduction research. And hopefully, I'm going to give you some exit strategies for that, what we should be doing in order to correct this wrong. Rigor mortis is a characteristic stiffness of the body that follows after death. Okay? However, this very book here is about mortis of rigor, meaning an open accusation to the escalation of poor quality signs amongst different areas of scientific endeavors. This is not to say, of course, that all the science is bad, but certainly in some areas there is need for revitalization of this rigor, and I believe tobacco harm reduction science is one of those areas. We all know that there's been an epidemic, oh no, wrong, it's a pandemic of bad quality signs. You see very poor quality in vitro and animal research, defective epidemiological surveys, very bad quality controlled clinical trials, and all these are contributing and generating negative spins on the tools of tobacco harm reduction. So this unfortunately bad science is generating negative news about the effective role and the potential role of combustion-free products. I don't have the time to review 20, 30, 40 papers. I just picked one. And I picked this one, and I'll tell you in a minute why, so stay put. It's a paper that investigates the cells in the sputum of 3 groups of volunteers: smokers, electronic cigarette users, and never smokers. The conclusions of the paper are basically stated here. They found high levels of these nasty chemical pro-inflammatory mediators. They have a role in COPD, not only in the smokers, but also in electronic cigarette users. And the authors were led to conclude that switching from conventional cigarettes to electronic cigarettes is certainly not an healthier alternative and may even cause COPD. Right? Wrong. We have a problem here. The problem is that we cannot reach any meaningful conclusion from methodological flow study. Any conclusion at all. And in order to try to give more substance to what I'm saying, let's review what are the problems with this paper, and I'll try to focus on only one because a full appraisal of a paper will take hours, and I don't really want to bore you with that. So it is incredible that the authors themselves didn't pay any attention on any of those key methodological problems. And I just pick one because I think it's very focused, it's very important, it's very critical, and anybody amongst this audience will understand it, which is that electronic cigarette users, by default, are ex-smokers. So they have a less or more consistent history of smoking exposure. And you should know that there are many papers in the literature showing that ex-smokers have high levels of the very same mediators that have been measured by these very same authors. So that's the reason why you cannot reach any conclusion from studies like that. And ladies and gentlemen, this is not an isolated case. A plethora of poor quality studies is emerging these days. An army of researchers reiterating the same mistakes over and over again are needed to be educated properly. And as you see, all these papers here, they all fail on methodological assessments because they repeat the same problems that should be easily avoided. But there's a good news. I try to be and stay positive as far as I can. And the good news is that when you reiterate the same mistake over and over again, this will give you the chance to easily address them and to a large scale. So bad science can be effectively fixed. It takes people like me to say how to fix it, of course. I was joking. In the tobacco harm reduction science-specific space, there are, in my opinion, 4 problematic areas that requires urgent corrective measures. The areas are in vitro research, animal studies, clinical trials, and epidemiological surveys. This is what I call the quality research checklist for in vitro studies. I'm not going to go through the whole bullet point, but I'll just give you a couple examples to have the sense of the tragedy that we are facing. For example, many of these papers I've been reviewing over the last few years are fraught with the lack of standards. Lack of standards that they are required to make sure that the aerosol generation of this protocol is close to a normal condition of use. The protocol generation should not be close to overeating conditions. Does not make sense. This is not what the users get in their lungs every day. On the same line, lack of standards, the exposure protocols do need to approximate the human exposure time. There is no point in trying to translate data from monolayers of cells that have been exposed continuously for up to 24 hours to something that we know our body is exposed up to 20 or 30 minutes a day. Because if the average is 200 puff, and if the average is 5 seconds a puff, if you're very good at math, and I'm not, but a friend of mine is very good, he told me it's going to be about 20, 30 minutes. And of course, the natural comparator needs to be in these studies, because most of this research is about relative risk. And if you include a comparator, you really need to have a good estimate of how much of the comparator is there. So dosimetry needs to be there, and we need standards for dosimetry as well. Because then how can I compare the data within the same experiment or between different experiments? That's going to be impossible. And this is all about science, the ability to compare data across different labs. Animal studies. I mean, the poor animals are suffering the same overkilling that the cells in vitro are have been subjected to in these studies. You know, one of the problems I have with animal studies, let's forget about the relevance of studying animals when you do behavioral science or anything like this. But to me, the key problem with the animals is their weight. You really need to consider that mice is 25 milligrams, okay? So you should compare that to a human body, which is 75,000 milligrams. It's 3,000 times smaller than a human body. And yet you expose these animals to the same amount of mass vapor that you expose the animal. This is basically, it's like over-polluting the animals in a little cage. And the data generated from these models is not very useful. And of course, I can talk for hours in clinical studies. This is particularly my area. I can talk about defective surveys. We published with David Abrams a paper who was actually touching upon these studies. But in particular, I would like to remind you that the self-reporting of tobacco and nicotine products use is unreliable, and for a number of reasons. We're using obsolete method. The standard method of research and survey is questionnaires and from surveys. And, you know, let's take an example. The recall bias is problematic. The norm, the social norm in some countries, like in the US, is driving an answer instead of another. Let's face it, many smokers in the US will not tick the box smoking for these reasons. So we really need a 21st century innovation in this space in order to improve self-reporting, which is clearly inaccurate. And the idea comes from the Internet of Things and the collection of big masses of data exploiting the possibility of sending big information through the Internet or through Bluetooth technology. This is just an example. In real time, you can automatically download the vaping behavior through an app installed in a smartphone, and this can be stored automatically in a cloud server for analytics. And the beauty is that the cloud servers can talk back to the app, so can provide feedback to the users. And you know, when the user has some feedback, it will be more lenient in using these technologies. Another way is to pair up these with the wristable technology that can inform about the detection of smoking movement. And of course, it is a no-brainer that this is going to surpass questionnaires and in surveys. Besides the checklist and besides the new technology, there is also the possibility of setting up technical committees with the right stakeholders. Now, the problem with technical committees is to have the right composition in technical committees. My suggestion is to have independent stakeholders, particularly in the epidemiological space. If you want to do this in epidemiology, you can do this, of course, in clinical and preclinical as well, but they need to be detached from the inflammatory debate. Otherwise, this technical committee will be totally useless. I really think that a constructive debate, it is possible. So it is a difficult job, last slide. But I'm a very positive person. I think from challenges leave greater opportunities. And one such great opportunity is that we can resurrect rigor and we can make tobacco harm reduction science credible again. Thank you.